Your hit traveled 112 yards with major slice and landed in a bunker.
Okay, turn off the simulator. You know, they always say that practice makes perfect, but what they forget to tell you is that it also makes for piss-boiling frustration. Hello, subjects. Professor Cynic here. I've been trying to polish up on my golf swing a little bit. I built a golfing simulator for the laboratory, and, you know, I just haven't been... this thing. Yeah, so, see, Amazon isn't too keen on delivering to hidden basement laboratories. Thank you very much, Mr. Bezos. But, you know, I've never been too interested in golf as a sport. It takes up far too much real estate, people get all snooty about the etiquette, and most of its amateur players are made up of crusty old men. I mean, have you ever stepped foot inside of a golf clubhouse? It smells like the inside of an aqua velva factory. That's the amazing thing about video games. See, they have the ability to spark interest where there previously was none. Take Mario Tennis Power Tour, for example. It combined a sport, tennis, with RPG elements masterfully in such a way that it got me interested in a sport that I never would have cared about otherwise. I mean, I never ended up playing any tennis, but I look back with fondness on those times that I imagined myself playing tennis. And that was pretty good. But why the sudden interest in golf, you ask? Well, I recently picked up a game called Golf Story, and just like Power Tour, it combines RPG elements with a sport, in this case, golf. Is Golf Story a hole-in-one? Or is it a divot on the green? Let's take a look. I don't know golf terminology, I'm sorry. You know, it's a bad joke. Here's the review. Here's the review.
If you want to avoid minor narrative spoilers, skip ahead to this part in the video. Golf Story follows the journey of a nameless protagonist, you, through his journey to become a professional golf player. The story opens with you as a child, with your father teaching you the basic principles of golf, which serve as a tutorial, though more advanced mechanics are explained further in the game. Once the tutorial concludes, you wake up in your home as an adult and venture over to the well-worn Grove golf course to begin your journey to become a pro. The basic story premise leaves a lot to be desired. The opening scene with your father leads you to believe that this storyline will flesh out further into the game. Does he come back into your life? Did something happen to him? Was he the reason you sought to get into the pros all along? But ultimately, that story arc goes mostly unexplored after the tutorial. Because that arc isn't explored further, it doesn't make for a particularly interesting basis for a story. I want to become a pro because we need to make a video game about it, essentially becomes the basis for the story. Putting this fault aside, the narrative starts to unfold once you begin interacting with the characters in the world. Initially, the dialogue was a bit off-putting. It just felt like it was trying too hard to be clever, and ended up coming off as tacky. However, as the game went on, I started to find that the tacky dialogue was admittedly a bit endearing. I think the writing improves over the course of the game, and even more corny lines got a few chuckles out of me. The developers did a good job of developing at least some of the characters into flawed, funny, and entertaining individuals. There were a couple points that were a bit frustrating because the dialogue dragged on for far too long, and I don't consider myself impatient when it comes to narrative, but sometimes it felt like conversations between characters went on for an unnecessarily long time. Golf Story gets a C+ for narrative. Golf Story progresses by having you complete notes. You can think of notes as quests or missions. As you interact with other characters, you will take notes on tasks you need to accomplish. Most of them drive the progression of the game, but some could be considered side quests or side notes, whatever. By far the best notes, you know what, I'm just gonna call them quests. The best quests are the ones that simply have you play rounds of golf. You might play someone to prove that you have better skills, or to take one step closer to becoming a pro. Either way, the reason doesn't really matter. Golf Story is at its best when you're playing golf. Anytime you're playing an actual game of golf, it'll be a round of 9 holes. The game does a good job of slowly introducing you to the golfing mechanics so that you don't feel bombarded. And there are plenty of different mechanics that you'll need to master to become proficient at golfing. You can pick your club, adjust your distance, shape your shots, and so on. To an outsider looking in, it can appear pretty daunting to understand what all of these mechanics do. But because the game does a good job of explaining how to use them and when, I really didn't feel overwhelmed. In fact, I thought it added a palatable amount of complexity that made me think about each shot I had to take. And while playing golf overall was executed very well, my one gripe is how putting works. It turns out that 2D pixel art makes for a shitty putting experience, because you can't get a good grasp on the slope of the green. The player has to completely rely on an arrow to inform their putting decision, which only tells you if there is a minor, moderate, or high slope, and the direction it slopes in. Despite specifically practicing putting, I could never really get the hang of it. I feel like a much better solution to the arrow would have been some kind of elevation overlay that the player could toggle on and off on the green to get a better idea of how to set up the shot. Instead, I struggled so much with the putting that I would purposely aim my drives and mid-range shots for the rough, because I had a far better chance of chipping the ball into the hole than I did putting it in with a putt. Which is really sad, because the golfing experience would have been nearly perfect if this point was executed a bit better. It's worth noting that you can play a quick game of golf with 2 players. This is really fun, and I even tried it in tablet mode. Each player gets one Joy-Con turned sideways. Even though it's not terribly comfortable playing this way, it's mitigated by the fact that there isn't much action going on, so you really aren't holding the controller for long stretches of time. You line up your shot, swing, and it's the next player's turn. And despite only having the little Joy-Con to play on, all of the mechanics found in the regular story mode are still present in multiplayer. The other quests and activities you can complete involve not playing golf, but doing something kind of golf related anyway. These are really hit and miss, and many of them feel like filler material. Some of them are genuinely entertaining, like helping mow the lawn with a crazy groundskeeper, or attempting to solve a mystery while locked up in a clubhouse with a bunch of elderly golfers. But many of them are talk to this person so you can go to the driving range and hit balls into a specific zone over and over and over again, which can really bring the mood down. I understand it helps the player hone their skills, but why not accomplish that through playing more rounds of golf, which is, the fun part of the game. I would have been more than happy to be forced to play more rounds of golf, as opposed to hitting chip shots into zones over and over again, only for my coach to give me snide remarks when I inevitably, up. As for the RPG elements, your character levels up as you complete rounds of golf and the training activities mentioned above. Once you level up, you're given 5 points that you can allocate to different stats: power, purity, strike, ability, and spin. Power is pretty self-explanatory, it adds to your maximum distance, but I really didn't understand how the other stats would affect my gameplay, and the game does a really poor job of explaining what the other stats do. And by poor job, I mean they don't explain them whatsoever. Unless I completely blew past a section that explains what these do, there was nowhere else in the game that I could find an explanation for the stats. Even a Google search brought up sparse results on the topic. What I did notice is that when adding points to power, all the other stats would drop. Based on the naming of the other 4 stats, I'm led to believe that these probably have some effect on the control of your hits. Which would make sense. If you're focusing on power, in theory, your control of a ball is going to take a bit of a hit. So my strategy was to slowly increase my power over time while allocating points to the other 4 categories to keep them as close to the middle as possible. I don't know if this was a good strategy or not, but I was able to complete the game anyway. Overall, the stats didn't feel like they had much bearing on my play overall, aside from being able to drive the ball slightly farther by game's end. It was really disappointing because I enjoy character specking in RPGs, and I feel like the developers may as well have excluded the feature here because of how poorly it was implemented. You can also buy different sets of clubs throughout the course of the game. This is another disappointing aspect because the clubs don't really feel like they have much of an impact. For instance, one point in the game, you try to gain membership at the Tidy Park golf course. The theme of this course is that its members are primarily senior citizens. To gain access to the course, you need to find a complete set of vintage clubs, which translates to shitty old golf clubs. The stats on the clubs are purposefully bad. I switched to this set of clubs to get into the Tidy Park course, and I forgot that I had them. I played several rounds of golf before realizing that I still had the vintage clubs equipped. The clubs, while being purposefully gimped, didn't make a big difference on my overall golf play. There are a few gimmicky clubs that can be helpful, like the lightning wedge, which helps you chip shots low and fast, or loft wedges, which add loft to your chip shot. But overall, you can pretty much throw any combination of clubs together and still expect to play pretty well. Like the stats, I again ask, what's the point? I know that Golf Story has been dubbed an RPG game about golf, but aside from the narrative elements that belong in an RPG, the other components fall flat. And maybe that's my fault for having some kind of expectation of what the RPG elements would be in Golf Story before playing. But either way, it left me wanting for more. Golf Story's gameplay gets a B-. As you've seen from the gameplay, Golf Story's visual style is similar to games from the 16-bit era. Admittedly, I'm a sucker for the pixel art aesthetic. I think that Stardew Valley is a good comparison visually. And in this instance, I think the pixel art style is better executed in Stardew Valley. In fairness, I feel like the developers had a greater challenge with Golf Story because they didn't have much to work with. After all, golfing involves a lot of flat, boring, green environments. but I think that perhaps a bit more detail to the environment would have gone a long way, but this is a minor complaint. As for the audio, each course has its own music track. Most of the tracks are good, nothing that really stands out, but they're solid. There were a couple of tracks that got really grating after a while, and I ended up turning off the sound and putting on a playlist of my own. One that comes to mind is a track that uses what I think is MIDI bagpipes. Initially I thought, oh that's neat, MIDI bagpipes. Yeah, the neatness lasted probably a whole minute before the digitized Highland-induced insanity set in. It's probably not a soundtrack I'm going to seek outside of playing the actual game, but overall it works. Golf Story's visual gets a C+, and the audio a C. Currently, Golf Story is only available for digital download in Nintendo's eShop for $14.99. From some research online, it seems to take people an average of about 15 hours to complete the game. My playtime was at 17 hours when I completed the game, which is something I should mention. The game does clock playtime, which is a feature I love. Anyway, I played for 17 hours, and there's still some content for me remaining, in the form of secrets, additional notes I didn't complete, and I can always go back to previously visited courses to try and get a better score. Considering that this also has a multiplayer mode, which is a load of fun, I can only come to the conclusion that Golf Story is an absolutely smashing deal. If you're even remotely interested in this game, I would recommend dropping the $15 on it. It's hard to go wrong at that price point. Golf Story gets a perfect A for value.
And there you have it. That's Golf Story. You know, it's really hard to go wrong at a $15 price point. The multiplayer alone is worth that amount. And so plugging all of Golf Story's component grades into my rubric leaves it with a final grade of... you know what? Simulator. You've been listening, right? Why don't you tell the patient subjects what Golf Story's final grade is?
Golf Story receives a final grade of B-.
And with that, subjects, I remind you to always stay cynical.